In January of 1988, a federal judge in Washington told the Department of Defense that what it had been doing to the men of the Liberty ships for 43 years was arbitrary, and that it had to stop. Here is what those men had spent 43 years asking for. Not money. One word. Veteran. They were in their 60s by then. Most had sailed a Liberty ship through the war. A great many had been torpedoed on one and had been in the water. And the thing they had finally won had taken so long to arrive that almost everything attached to it was already useless to them. The college money was 40 years late. The home loan was 40 years late. The men who had needed it most were dead. Most people know the Liberty ship as an industrial miracle. 2,710 of them welded together in yards that had never built a ship before. That is the story everybody tells. Almost nobody tells you what happened to the men who took them to sea. And that is the part I want to give you, because their own country spent 4 decades arguing that they had not been in the war at all. By the end of this video, you will know who actually crewed those ships and why they were not sailors, in the way you are probably imagining, what the odds of coming home really were, and how they compare to the services everybody does remember, and the single detail on board that decided who counted as a veteran and who did not. And here is the one I would hold on to. It is not what you would guess, and it was sitting on the same deck the whole time. Before we go on, thank you for being here. I want to ask you something. Where in the world are you watching this from? And did anybody in your family sail merchant during the war? Those are the comments I read first. And on this subject, I know some of you are going to have a name. Start with the ship, but only briefly, because the ship is the part you have already heard. A Liberty ship was a cargo carrier about 440 feet long, built to a British design that was already old when the Americans took it. She carried roughly 10,000 tons. She was welded instead of riveted, which is why she could be built fast, and which is also why some of them cracked. President Roosevelt looked at the design and called her a dreadful-looking object. The name stuck as a compliment. Now, the point of her was never quality. The point was arithmetic. Germany was sinking Allied merchant ships faster than Britain could replace them, and the answer was not to build better ships. It was to build more ships than could be sunk. 2,710 of them were built. That is the number everybody quotes, and it is the reason this ship is famous. And it is worth 1 minute on who built them, because it is the same kind of story as the one I am about to tell you. The yards that turned these out were not established shipbuilders. Several of them were fields with a river frontage 2 years earlier. The workforce was hired off the street and taught one job each. This man welds this seam, that woman welds that seam, because there was no time to make shipwrights. A very large part of that workforce was women, in yards where a woman had never been employed before, and a very large part was black workers who had come north and west for the wages. They were building the ship in pieces in sheds, and the pieces were being lifted into place and joined. That is why a Liberty ship could be assembled in days, not because anybody was a genius, but because the work had been broken into parts small enough that a person could learn one in an afternoon. So the ship was built by people who were not shipbuilders, and she was crewed by men who were not sailors. That is the whole program in one sentence, and it worked. Now the part nobody quotes. A ship is a hull with people inside it, and somebody had to be inside these. Here is the first thing to understand, and it changes everything that follows. The men who sailed the Liberty ships were not in the Navy. They were employed by the War Shipping Administration, the federal agency that administered merchant mariners during the war. They were not in any service. They were civilian merchant seamen, employed under a contract, sailing under the flag of a shipping company. That was not an accident, and it was not a loophole somebody found later. It was how the American merchant fleet had always worked, and in 1941 nobody thought it mattered. Here is who they were. Some were professional sailors who had been at sea for 20 years, but a great many were men the armed services would not take. Too old, too young, flat feet, bad eyes, a heart murmur, a childhood illness, the long list of things that got a man marked unfit and sent home from the recruiting office. Those men went to the Merchant Marine instead because the Merchant Marine would have them. There were boys of 16 on those decks. There were men of 60. There were men who had been rejected by the army in the morning and were signing merchant articles in the afternoon because they had come to town to enlist and they were not going home to explain that nobody wanted them. And here is something else about those crews that gets left out. The Merchant Marine was racially integrated during the Second World War at a time when the United States Navy was not. Hugh Mulzac became the first black captain of a Liberty ship when he took command of the SS Booker T. Washington in 1942, and he insisted on an integrated crew. 3 other black captains, Adrian T. Richardson, John Godfrey, and Clifton Lastick, commanded mixed-race crews during the war as well. Black seamen served in every department aboard those ships, including as officers, and a handful commanded Liberty ships outright. Men who could not have held that rank in the Navy held it at sea, on a merchant hull, in the middle of a war. So this is the crew, not a warship's company. A mixed collection of the too old, the too young, the medically rejected, the career seamen, and men who were not welcome in the uniformed services at all. Now put them on the ship, and put the ship in the water. A Liberty ship made about 11 knots. That is not a figure of speech for slow. That is slow. A surface German submarine of that period was faster. If a U-boat found a convoy, the convoy could not outrun it. It could only hope. She had almost no armor. The plating that mattered was thin, because armor is weight and weight is cargo you cannot carry. And here is what she carried, which is the part that keeps me up. Ammunition, aviation fuel, high-octane petrol in drums, explosives for the invasion beaches, the things an army needs, which are all, without exception, the things you do not want to be standing on top of when a torpedo arrives. And here is a phrase the men used about certain cargoes. They said the ship was loaded, so that if she was hit there would be nothing to find. No wreck, no bodies, no lifeboats, just a flash on the horizon, and then a gap in the line where a ship had been. That happened. It happened repeatedly, and it happened in front of the other crews who could see it and who then had to keep station and keep going, because a convoy that scatters is a convoy that dies. And I want to sit on that for a moment because it is the single hardest rule of the whole business, and it does not appear in the industrial miracle version of this story at all. Now the rule. In convoy, a merchant ship does not stop for survivors. That is not cruelty, and it was not optional. A ship that stops is a ship standing still in water where a submarine is known to be, which makes her the easiest target at sea and puts her own crew in the water within the hour. So the order was to keep going. Designated rescue ships and escorts picked people up if they could, which means the ordinary experience, not the rare one, the ordinary one, was passing men in the water. Men you had eaten with in port, men waving, men in oil, and the ship you were standing on does not slow down because you are one of 40 ships in 9 columns and the columns hold. Crews described the noise of it more than the sight. You could hear them. There are accounts of men who did that crossing 4 and 5 times and never spoke about anything else afterwards, not the torpedoes. That. Keep this in mind for later, when you get to the argument that these men were employees who could have left the ship if they had wanted to. And here is the worst one. The North Atlantic was the main job, and it was bad enough, but there was a worse one. 40 convoys went to the Soviet Union, north around Norway, above the Arctic Circle, into the Barents Sea, to deliver war material to Murmansk. The SS Booker T. Washington under Mulzac made 22 round trips during the war. That route is called the Murmansk Run, and men who did both said the Atlantic was a holiday by comparison. Now, why that run was worse than the Atlantic? Everything about it was wrong. In summer, there was no darkness at all, so German aircraft and submarines could work around the clock. In winter, the sea froze on the ship faster than the crew could chip it off, and a ship carrying too much ice on her upperworks does not right herself when she rolls. She keeps going over, and the water was cold enough that a man in it had a few minutes, not hours, minutes. Here is the convoy everybody names. It went in the summer of 1942, carrying cargo worth around $700 million in the money of the day. The escort was pulled away on a warning of a German surface force, and the merchant ships were ordered to scatter and make for Russia individually. Slow, unarmored cargo ships, alone, in permanent daylight, with the whole German air and submarine effort in northern Norway hunting them. Most of them did not arrive. Now, the arithmetic of the whole thing, because this is the number that decides everything else in this video. Here is the number. 733 American merchant ships were sunk by enemy action. 9,521 merchant seamen died. That works out to roughly 4 in every 100 who served, about 1 man in 26. And that proportion is the highest of any American service in the Second World War. Higher than the Navy, higher than the Marines, higher than the Army. I want to be careful here because this figure gets thrown around loosely and it deserves precision. It is a proportion, not a total. The army lost far more men in absolute numbers because the army was enormous. What the merchant marine had was the worst odds. If you sailed merchant, your chance of not coming back was worse than it was for the men in uniform standing next to you. And I mean that literally, standing next to you, on the same deck. Here is the detail I promised you, and it is the hinge of the entire story. Liberty ships were armed, not heavily, but they had a gun forward, a gun aft, and anti-aircraft mounts on the wings. And those guns were not fired by the merchant crew. They were fired by a detachment of United States Navy personnel put aboard for the purpose, called the Naval Armed Guard. So on a Liberty ship crossing the Atlantic, you had two populations living in the same steel box. The merchant crew, who worked the ship, and the Navy gunners, who worked the guns. They ate together. They slept in the same accommodation. They stood on the same plates. When a torpedo came through the side, it did not check anybody's paperwork. But when the war ended, one of those two groups came home as a veteran of the United States Armed Forces, with everything that carried, and the other did not. Same ship, same voyage, same torpedo. One man is a veteran. The man next to him is a civilian who happened to be present. That is not a technicality that emerged later. That is what the law said, and it is what the law kept saying for 43 years. Now, how did that happen? Because it was not a single decision by a single villain, and I think that is the part worth understanding. During the war, the merchant marine was treated as essential. The government said so constantly. Roosevelt himself in 1944 described what they were doing as the biggest, the most difficult and dangerous transportation job ever undertaken. Recruiting material called them the fourth arm of defense. Men were told in plain words that they were serving. Then the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, the GI Bill, went through Congress in 1944, and it was written to cover members of the armed forces. The merchant seamen were not members of the armed forces. They were civilians, so they were not in it. There was an attempt to fix this at the time. A separate bill was put forward to give merchant seamen their own version of the benefits. It did not pass. And once the war was over, the political energy behind it evaporated in about the time it takes to hold one election. There were 16 million men coming home in uniform, and they were a constituency. The merchant seamen were a few 100,000 civilians with an argument, and here is where they landed. The men went home to nothing, and they went home at the worst possible moment for a merchant seaman, which is the other half of this that gets missed. The war ended, and overnight the world had far too many ships and far too many men to crew them. The emergency fleet that had been built to replace losses was suddenly a surplus. Hiring halls that had taken anybody with a pulse in 1942 had queues around the block by 1946. So the man who had spent 4 years on the Murmansk Run came ashore into an industry that was contracting with no benefit, no schooling, and a skill, steam engineering on a wartime cargo ship, that was about to stop being wanted. Meanwhile, the man he had shared a cabin with, the Navy gunner, was being paid to go to college. Here is what nothing means, because it is easy to hear the words GI Bill and not register what was actually being handed out. A returning serviceman could go to college with tuition paid and a living allowance while he studied. He could get a home loan with no deposit, at a rate he could afford, which is how an entire American generation moved out of rented rooms and into houses they owned. He could get unemployment pay while he found work. He could be treated in a veterans hospital for the rest of his life. A merchant seaman who had spent 4 years hauling ammunition to Murmansk got none of it. And here is what else he could not get: the ordinary things. There were mariners who could not join a veterans organization because they were not veterans. There were men who were told they could not be buried with a flag because they had not served. And the practical effect compounded quietly over decades in a way that is easy to miss. The GI Bill was not just money. It was the on-ramp to the whole American middle class in the 1950s. The man who took it got a degree, and the degree got him a job, and the job and the loan together got him a house, and the house appreciated for 30 years and became the thing he left to his children. The man who did not take it started behind and stayed behind, and so did his children. So this is not a story about a certificate. It is a story about a fork in the road that 2 men on the same ship were sent down based on which department had signed their paperwork. Now, the 43 years. Now here is the part that gets left out. The mariners did not go quietly, and that is worth saying because the way this is usually told makes them sound passive. They were not. They organized. They wrote to congressmen, they gave testimony, they kept producing the same documents, the ship's articles, the discharge papers, the letters from the War Shipping Administration telling them they were serving their country for 4 decades, and they were told no and no and no. The bureaucratic reasoning is worth hearing because it is so thin. In 1977, Congress passed a law that created a route. A civilian group that had worked for the armed forces during the war could apply to the Secretary of the Air Force, who ran the process, and be recognized as having served on active duty. That law was Public Law 95-202. The women who had flown military aircraft in the United States, the WASPs, got their recognition that way. The merchant mariners applied. They were turned down. The Secretary of the Air Force, who administered the decision process under the law, denied the application. The reasoning was, in effect, that they had been employees. They had been paid. They could, in theory, have left the ship. Anybody who has read a mariner's account of the Murmansk Run will know what to do with that argument. But it held on paper, and paper is what the process ran on. And there was a practical problem underneath the legal one, which almost nobody mentions, and which defeated a lot of men on its own. To be recognized, a mariner had to prove where he had been, not describe it. Prove it with documents. But a merchant seaman's record was not held by a service. It was held by the shipping company that had employed him, voyage by voyage. And by 1980, most of those companies had been sold, merged, or had simply stopped existing. Their paperwork went into a skip somewhere in the 1950s, and the man's own copies, the discharge slips he had been handed at the end of each voyage, were 40 years of house moves away. Some men had them in a drawer. Many did not, because nobody had told them in 1946 that a piece of paper from a shipping line would one day be the only thing standing between them and being counted. So even after the door opened, there were men who could not walk through it, because the evidence that they had been torpedoed in the Barents Sea had been thrown away by a company that no longer existed. Now, the court, so they went to court. In 1987, a case was brought against the Secretary of the Air Force over that refusal. The lawsuit was brought by American Merchant Marine Veterans, the organization founded in 1984 that had led the recognition fight. And in January of 1988, a federal judge in the District of Columbia found that the decision to deny them had been arbitrary, that the reasoning did not hold up, and sent it back to be decided again. Now, here is how it came out the second time, the other way. On the 19th of January, 1988, merchant mariners who had served in ocean-going service during the war years were recognized as having been on active duty. The recognition was granted under Public Law 105-368, veterans, 43 years. And here is the part I find hardest. Here is the arithmetic of a man's life. A seaman who was 20 in 1944 was 64 in 1988. The college money was for a young man. He was not a young man. The home loan was for somebody starting out. He had either bought a house the hard way 30 years earlier, or he had not. The unemployment pay was for the year after the war, and the war had been over since before his children were born. What was actually left by 1988 was medical care in a veteran's hospital, a burial allowance, and a flag. That is not nothing. Men who fought for this for 40 years did not think it was nothing, and I am not going to tell you it was. Being called what you are matters, and it mattered enormously to them, but it arrived at the end. The benefits that would have changed a life arrived at an age where a life has already been lived. And the men who had needed it most, the ones who came home injured in 1945, the ones who could not work, the ones whose widows got nothing because their husbands had not been servicemen, those men were 40 years dead. And there is one more thing later. In recent years, Congress voted to award the merchant mariners of the Second World War the Congressional Gold Medal, which is the highest honor the legislature can give. By then, the number of them still alive to receive it was very small. So, the ships. 2,710 Liberty ships were built. Almost all of them are gone. They were built to last 5 years, and most did not get many more than that. They were sold off, laid up in reserve fleets in quiet rivers, and cut up for scrap through the 1960s and 70s. Now, what happened to the hulls? Because there was a long middle chapter before the scrapping, which this channel has stood in front of before. They were laid up. Hundreds of Liberty ships were taken up quiet rivers and estuaries and moored in blocks, 8 and 10 abreast, tied to each other, with a skeleton watch and a dehumidifier running. Reserve fleets. Ghost fleets, if you have ever driven past one. The program was formalized in 1946 by the Merchant Ship Sales Act and became the National Defense Reserve Fleet, managed by the Maritime Administration at sites including the James River in Virginia, Beaumont in Texas, and Suisun Bay in California. They sat there for years, in some cases for decades. A few were pulled out again for Korea. A few carried grain. Most just sat, rusting slowly in fresh water, while the country that built them decided what they were for. And then, one at a time through the 60s and 70s, a tug came and took each one to a breaker, and a man with a torch cut her into pieces the length of a car. That is what happened to 2,700 of them. Not a battle, a tug and a torch and a scrap price. Now the three that are left. 3 Liberty ships are afloat today. Here is the first, the Hellas Liberty in Greece, preserved as a museum and not going anywhere. The other 2 are American, and both of them still work. The John W. Brown is in Baltimore. She is not a static exhibit. She is a functioning steamship, kept running by volunteers, and she goes to sea. And here is the last one. The Jeremiah O'Brien is in San Francisco, and she is the reason I wanted to end here. The O'Brien was at Normandy. She made 11 round trips across the English Channel in the summer of 1944, hauling to the beaches. In 1994, for the 50th anniversary of the landings, they decided to take her back. The crew included cadets from the United States Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point, New York, the Federal Service Academy established in 1943 that had trained thousands of wartime officers, including 142 cadets who died in the war. Not on a barge, under her own power. San Francisco, out through the Golden Gate, down the length of the Americas, through the Panama Canal, across the Atlantic, to England, and then to Normandy. Of all the thousands of vessels in the invasion fleet, she was the only large ship that came back for the anniversary. The only one. And here is the crew that took her. They were the old men, the mariners and engineers who had done this work in the war, brought back to run a 1943 steam plant across 2 oceans, with a handful of cadets from the California Maritime Academy aboard to learn and to carry things. The average age of that crew was about 70 years old, and they took a 50-year-old ship from San Francisco to Normandy because nobody else could run her, and because they wanted to. That was 6 years after their country had finally agreed to call them veterans. Here is the last thing. Everything on this channel is a version of the same question. A ship gets built, gets used, and then somebody decides what she was worth. Scrapyard, museum, or the bottom. This is the only one where the question was asked about the men instead of the hull, and the answer took 43 years and a federal judge. The Steel got a verdict quickly, 2,710 Liberty ships, and the decision on almost every one of them was made in an afternoon by somebody looking at a scrap price. 3 are left. That is the whole judgment on the ships. The men took 4 decades, and the judgment, when it came, was mostly too late to be any use. So if there was a merchant seaman in your family, tell me his name and the ship, not the story. I know the story is often not there, because a lot of these men did not talk about it, and some of them stopped talking about it precisely because they had spent years being told it did not count. Just the name and the ship. That is enough. Somebody reading these comments will recognize one of them, and that is the closest thing to a record that most of these crews ever got.